This is an examination of British North America. We are going to identify key people and events in British colonialism, examine government institutions in colonial society, place the British Empire in the Atlantic system, and understand the origins of American slavery. Early English colonialism didn't start by attempting to send English citizens and subjects from England itself to the Americas. Instead, early English imperialism had a bit of a darker side to it, and that was piracy, what was oftentimes referred to as privateering in this time period. Keep in mind, in the 1500s, as the Europeans were beginning to expand outward, England found itself on the edge of a transformed Europe. Not only had new science opened up new horizons to explorers, but the Protestant Reformation had fragmented Christianity into multiple different groups, all of whom had at some time or another disputes with all of the others. Now, while the Protestant nations usually got along with each other in their efforts to ward off the Spanish and the British, the Protestants and the Spanish and their prospective kings and queens oftentimes found themselves, if not at war, then in a state of outright hostility and intrigue. So early English imperialism turned to pirates as a way to weaken a much larger, a much more powerful, and a much more wealthy Spanish empire that, through marriage and connections, grew to include the lands of the Habsburg family in the Holy Roman Empire. So the first heroes of English activities overseas were not the likes of individuals such as William Penn or John Winthrop. Instead, it was the likes of individuals looking for profit, individuals like Sir Francis Drake and Sir Walter Raleigh, individuals that may have had an interest in turning the Americas profitable for the English, but at the time found it a bit easier to simply prey on the caravans of troops heading from the Spanish colonies in the Caribbean and in what is modern day Central America to Spain itself. Finally, in the late 1500s, Sir Walter Raleigh did attempt the very first English colony located near the future site of their colony at Jamestown, Virginia. And this was the ill-fated Roanoke colony. As the story goes, Sir Walter Raleigh saw the installment of his first boatloads of colonists in 1584, 1585. They initially began to establish their what was called then plantation or settlement. However, when Walter Raleigh wanted to go and to make sure that the colony was growing, his ships were diverted instead to help ward off the famous Spanish Armada in England's fight for survival that rested on repulsing an attempt by Spanish forces to invade England proper. As such, when the English finally did return to Roanoke Colony, the only thing that they found was one word scrawled into the beam of an entryway, which was Croatoan. To date, there is no official record. There is no real evidence of whatever happened to them, although historians generally agree that what likely happened was that they intermarried and intermerged with surrounding Native American tribes in an effort to survive. Now, after the ill-fated Roanoke attempt, the first permanent settlement was an undertaking of a private company by the name of the Virginia Company of London. Investors poured money into the venture, hoping that they would strike it wealthy not only with agricultural crops and furs, but in their greatest hopes, they would strike it rich with by discovering gold, other precious metals in the lands that the crown had given them. The first colony was established at Jamestown, and facing starvation, facing mutiny, facing the potential dissolving of the settlement, Captain John Smith did manage to establish neutral, if not peaceful, relations with the local Powhatan Confederacy, the most powerful confederacy in that area. Now, Disney has left us with the mistaken impression that John Smith was, a gallant individual, and that he fell deeply in love with Pocahontas. In other words, the myth, the imagery, the mythical story of Jamestown. But as usual, history is a little more complex than that. First off, John Smith. We do recognize that, yes, he was a former soldier, but you could also liken him today as almost a mercenary. He had fought in different battles around the world, or with English armies and other foreign armies. And one thing does constantly, one theme does tend to reappear in his writings and his recollections of his journeys. And that is that usually if he finds himself in a battle and taken prisoner by, say, an old Ottoman sultan, that the sultan's daughter inevitably threw herself across him and spared his life. If you've heard this story before, it's because it's the one he also told about his first encounter with Pocahontas. Today we realize that John Smith, he was both a capable leader and he was also flawed. We do recognize today that Pocahontas did not fall madly and deeply in love with him, and that much of the alliance that was established between the English settlers at Jamestown and the Powhatan Confederacy owed, first of all, to a depletion in numbers by the Powhatan Confederacy from diseases that had spread through their villages. It was also owing to the leader, whose name was Powhatan, and his desire to establish trade relations and to gain access to markets that would provide him with the weapons and the steel implements and the other items that the English enjoyed. But we do also know that today, much of it was downright plain old fashioned human decency. When the English arrived, they were not ready to settle in the New World. First off, when they showed up, they didn't simply have farmers and artisans. You also had merchants, people out seeking glory, gold hunters, who got off the ship, basically made themselves some crude living quarters, and then immediately began to explore the surrounding terrain. Little real attention was set on defenses or finding the perfect site for settlement. It wasn't really devoted to getting food, establishing crops, and filling granaries. In fact, Jamestown itself, we recognize, was located on part of the river that does not really allow for good drainage. It does not provide with good, wholesome, fresh water. So disease was rampant at Jamestown. And when winter set in, starvation quickly followed behind disease, adding to their miseries. In fact, in 1607, there were 104 settlers at Jamestown. When spring came around in 1608, there were only 38 left. To simply survive that time period, as well as the following winter of 1609 to 1610, another period known as the Starving Time, the Virginians did not actually resort to founding institutions of democracy. Instead, they turned to martial law. So the Powhatans Confederacy, recognizing the potential in, operating from a desire to just simply help these people who were dying in large numbers, established good relations with the English and helped them survive these early days of colonization. Now, in 1612, events finally started taking a turn for the better. First of all, there was a marriage to be celebrated, but it was not between John Smith and Pocahontas. Instead, it was between John Rolfe and Pocahontas. Pocahontas, after the marriage, went to England for a tour in which she was lauded as a famous celebrity. Unfortunately, she would never return to her homeland. She died there of illness. John Rolfe not only cemented his the relations with the Powhatan Confederacy with this, but really secured for the Virginians, at least for a very brief time, peace enough to begin to allow Jamestown to grow outward. Now, in 1612, John Rolfe, in addition to marrying Pocahontas, also successfully developed a hybrid tobacco plant. And it was this hybrid tobacco plant that was durable enough to grow in Virginia climate, but also sweet enough to make people want to purchase it and to smoke it, that made the Virginia Company stop its plans at actually dissolving this colony, this failed colony as they saw it, and to continue to support it and invest in it. Now, 7 years later, two events happened that really did foreshadow the history of much of the United States of America. First off, the settlers in Virginia established what was called a House of Burgesses. This was a local legislative body that worked with the royal governor to establish laws, to establish, some sort of a legal system. And it was a body in which large landowners not only could serve without having to have a title of nobility, but that they could also vote for their representative. So while we start to see the early stages of representative democracy in this area, don't confuse it with outright democracy or broad-based representative democracy that is established in the United States today. Now, that same year, a Dutch ship also landed on the shores of Virginia, and within its cargo were the very first slaves to be introduced into this colony. Now, it was at this time that slavery was introduced, but as we'll see in a bit, it was not introduced in the way that most people are familiar with, the system of slavery that existed in antebellum United States. It was one that was much different. Now, one of the things that the Virginia Company did to draw people to their colony was offering a head right. So they relied on the head right system. Basically, any colonist that could afford his or her own passage to the New World would receive 50 acres of land for each person that he financed. This in and of itself caused a boom in settlement. First of all, you had individuals who wanted to pay for the prospect of starting their life in the Americas with their own stretch of land. But even if they were not willing to go there themselves, the prospect of financing other people and thus amassing land that way and becoming absolute or absent landlords also promoted a lot of investment. Now, large waves of colonists in this time period included a number of indentured servants. Indentured servants were people who signed away a part of their life in exchange for passage to the New World. Usually, indentured servants' contracts were around 7 years. And at this time period, they were de facto slaves to the landowner. However, there were provisions within the contract that did place limits. First of all, on the time period that they owed servitude towards the person holding their indentured servitude, their contract. But also, there were some protections, though very limited, uh, in the contract about how for the indentured servants. Now, this doesn't mean that the indentured servants' lives in the New World were a fairy tale. In fact, they were often very harsh. They were filled with danger, possible disease. For women, they definitely carried with it the predations, the possible predations of their masters. So it was a rough existence, but many did not mind the indentured servitude, because at the end of it they were expected, or at least their master was expected them to give them land and supplies enough to start their own farmstead. So they sacrificed a period of their life in exchange for a future. Now, in 1622, a crisis occurred within Virginia colony, and this was the first conflict against the Powhatan Confederacy. 1622, by 1622, both Pocahontas and Powhatan had died, and Powhatan was replaced by his brother Opechancanough. Opechancanough recognized that English expansion would not cease, that it would be constant. And so in 1622, as relations between the two sides hardened, war broke out. Initially, it looked like it was going to be a victory for the Powhatan Confederacy. Of the 1,200 colonists, the Powhatan's warriors killed about 347, including John Rolfe and some prominent colonial leaders. It seemed as though Opechancanough could possibly rid his land of the English threat and potentially push them back into the sea. However, the English did manage to rally and to defend themselves until a standstill. Now, this fundamentally changed the relationship between the Virginia Company and the Crown. Upset over the recent attack, tired of hearing about fiscal mismanagement, James I revoked the London Company's charter and instead transformed it into a royal colony. From that point on, all governors were appointed by the king. They reported directly to the king. And as such, the royal governors should have had absolute power if it worked on paper the way it did in reality. The reality is, though, that all governors, though they were agents of the king, unless they were a proprietary colony, usually had to find some sort of balance between the king's orders and the colonists' demands. After all, the governor did have to live in the colonies, and if he provoked them too much, could easily face their wrath. Now, in 1644, another conflict broke out between the Powhatan Confederacy and the English. Once again, the Powhatan experienced success in the conflict. Ultimately, though, especially with new backing by the royal crown, the Powhatan offense were not able to break through the English's defenses. The English succeeded at this time to actually take Opechancanough prisoner, and Opechancanough himself was shot in the back of the head by a colonist when he was on his way to prison in Jamestown. So English colonial life would continue to grow as more settlers arrived. Tobacco, indigo, other major crops began to appear and provides funds for the large plantations that were starting to develop. And at this time period, much of Virginian politics was dominated by the Tidewater, what they called aristocracy at the time. These larger plantation owners that had land, slaves, and servants, and often controlled the House of Burgesses. Increasingly, though, many people living in the hinterland, in the area away from the larger settlements, were going more and more restive. First of all, they were growing tired of the control that the Tidewater elites held over the House of Burgesses. And second of all, they, in their homesteads, were oftentimes held back by the House of Burgesses from establishing new homes and defenses deeper into the back country, because the governor and the Tidewater planters did not want to alienate and provoke the Native Americans. As a result, in 1676, a rebellion began, which briefly overthrew the royal government, but was eventually put down after the death of the leader, Nathaniel Bacon. Now, Bacon's rebellion had long-term, long-lasting implications for the colonies. At the time of the rebellion, most of the people that flocked to Bacon's banners were not only poor farmers, but they were indentured servants and slaves. At this time, much of the workers in this area of the British North America lived next to each other. In fact, it would not be uncommon to see a slave owner out working in the fields with his slave. You had freed African slaves that would marry former English indentured servants. So interethnic relationships were not uncommon. But with the overthrow of the colonial government, the House of Burgesses, the larger plantation owners, sought to prevent this from ever happening again. One of the ways that they did this was by clamping down on the liberties of the slaves themselves. In addition to that, they would also seek to purposely begin to drive wedges between the English colonists and between African slaves and African freedmen. This brings the attention to slavery. Early slavery began during the early phases of colonization. Keep in mind that there were attempts to establish colonies on the mainland of the Americas, but the first truly successful colonies began actually in the Caribbean. Many of the Caribbean, the future Caribbean settler societies either began on a manner similar to that of Hispaniola, becoming an outpost of a European empire, or they often began as a stopover, a supply post for early pirates. Whatever their early origins, early colonies were established here. And in the mid-1600s, sugar became a viable cash crop, a viable luxury crop in this part of the world after the Dutch improved on the techniques and the technology needed to mass produce this luxury item. Now, one thing about sugar production is that most indentured servants did not want to do it. It is a long, toiling process during the harvest season. From the moment that you cut the sugar cane down to the moment you crush it, process it into the raw form of sugar known as muscovado, and then later refined it a little bit further, you had roughly about 24 hours. If it wasn't transformed into muscovado within 24 hours, the crop was gone. It was wasted. So you needed a workforce that you could push relentlessly for long shifts, hard labor during the harvest era. Since indentured servants didn't want to do this, since they could no longer lure Englishmen and women to the colonies to provide the labor, instead, English sugar plantations began to follow the Spanish and the Dutch and turn increasingly to Africa. African slaves were brought in. They were from different tribes, different languages, different regions of Africa. As such, the plantation owners viewed them as much easier to control. In addition to that, they were not English subjects, and therefore they were not protected by the king's laws. To add to this even further, many Africans were not Christian. They followed animist beliefs or potentially practiced Islam. And since they were not Christian, they were not necessarily protected by any other Christian code of conduct. As such, African slaves' lives on sugar plantations was very brutal and very short. Statistics show us that slaves averaged about a 10-year lifespan once they arrived on the plantation. Within 10 years, if they stayed on the plantations in the Caribbean, on sugar plantations, they were dead. Moreover, plantation owners in the Caribbean became so fabulously wealthy that many of them didn't even continue to live in the Caribbean. Instead, they would often return to their home country and live an opulent lifestyle on the profits. Since the profits were so high, that meant that they did not have to invest in their workforce. Instead, they decided that it was easier to work a slave brutally and for long hours, to death if necessary, because they could simply replace him or her. As such, the slave codes that developed on Barbados reflect this brutal treatment, this transformation, legal transformation of a human into what was called chattel, or property, no different than livestock. As such, the Caribbean quickly boomed with settlement, or with settlers. It became an indispensable link in the growing Atlantic system. The Atlantic system is the system today is the term that we use today to describe the connection between the Americas, the Caribbean, and Europe, Africa, and really even beyond that, as in the 1700s, European fleets would take trade in European military power to South Asia, to East Asia, and onward. This was the same trade that we used to refer to as the triangular trade. We called it the triangular trade because goods and supplies would journey from to and from the New World in Europe, or from the Americas in Europe. From there, they would also travel to and from Europe and Africa, and from Africa to and from the Americas. Now, today we recognize that it's not so simple of a relationship. For example, ships did not simply go from the Americas to Europe, from Europe to Africa, from Africa to the Americas, and then back on it again. It did not operate this way. Instead, it was a network of networks. So, for example, New England was intimately connected into the Atlantic system. Now, what they did, the service they provided, was that of ships and shipping. They would oftentimes stop in the middle and the southern colonies for things such as deer hides and agricultural products, which they would then take to the Caribbean. And then on their return voyage, they would stop off with shipments of slaves, sell them before returning home to New England with their wealth. So while you may only be connected directly to one small part of it, you were a part of the entire new system. So this is the new type of system, a system of slavery that people viewed as essential to the continuation of this very profitable Atlantic system, and a new system of slavery based on rights and based on the dehumanization of people that Europeans viewed as other than themselves, that they viewed as lesser than themselves. Following Bacon's rebellion, the plantation owners of Virginia turned to Barbados. They turned to the English colonies in the Caribbean for models of how to run their new plantations. As many of the sons and the next generation of plantation owners found that they could no longer own land in the Caribbean, in places like Jamaica and Barbados, since it had been all purchased, they turned their attention northward to the southern British North America. And they carried with them their Barbados slave codes or slave laws. It was these laws that basically said, in the eyes of the law, a slave, an African slave, was property of the master. And not only the individual, but also the individual's children. These slave laws were the ones that placed strict restrictions on freeing one's slaves. In fact, in many southern colonies and later states, one would have to go to the representative body to get a slave manumitted. These slave codes expressly forbade intermarriage and other relations between people of African and European descent. These are the slave codes that would later strip from slaves the right to be able to read or write. It was this slave code that made corporal punishment legal within the eyes of the state. And although there were supposed to be some limitations on the amount of force that a slave owner could use on the slave, no slave was able to stand as a witness to the death of another slave, at the hands of a slave master, in order for the slave master to be convicted. Now, Virginia was the first, and Virginia would become the first of the southern southern plantations. Behind Virginia would come the Carolinas in Georgia. All of these would turn to this aristocratic, hierarchical colonial system that reinforced what we call patriarchy, or the absolute control of the male owner of the land over not only his family, but also the people that worked for him and his slaves. There was one brief exception to this new slave culture, this new slave society that depended on slavery that was developing, and that was Georgia. Initially, it was a penal colony that outlawed slavery. But once Virginia and the Carolinas began pumping out so much wealth in terms of tobacco and other crops, the prohibitions against slavery in Virginia quickly disappeared. Now, shifting our attention northward, we see a new region of colonial culture, and that is the New England colonies. The New England colonies tended to be fiercely Protestant, and usually Protestant of a dissenter group, such as the Puritans. They usually were societies that revolved around, first of all, smaller family farms, free labor in the sense that you did not have slave labor. That's what we mean by free labor. We'll be using that term as we continue through other videos on American society. And so we recognize that they came from different places in England. They had different values, different cultures, different ways of living. So we treat them as a culturally distinct area in the colonies. So the very first of the New England colonies was a settlement that was established by separatists at Plymouth. Keep in mind, separatists were individuals that wanted to completely separate away from the Church of England because they believed that it was too close to Catholicism and could not be purged of Catholicism. When they set out, they realized that they were a small community establishing a home in a foreign land. So before landing, they signed the Mayflower Compact. And this compact basically obliged all men in all of their households to abide by the laws created by the leaders of the community. It's often been touted as the first democratic document of America because the male heads of a household you know, had a role in signing it. But really, what it was a means of preserving order, not necessarily even democratic order. Keep in mind, the leaders are establishing the laws, and the leaders are often the church leaders and the elders. Now, initially, there was a struggle for the Puritans, the separatists to survive, the Pilgrims to survive, but they were fortunate in meeting Samoset and Squanto. And these were two individuals who were able to teach them what they needed to not only cultivate the lands in that area, but also to build shelter. They connected them as well with Massasoit of the Pakanakets, what we call the Wampanoag Confederacy. And they would quickly establish good relations with the Wampanoags. So it was this combination, as well as the fact that they came in families, they came in family units that promised to work together, that helped them to avoid the prolonged suffering that the Virginia colonists experienced. Now behind them came another group of settlers, also dissenters within England, and these were the Puritans. They themselves actually to get out of control by the crown formed their own company, the Massachusetts Bay Company. And by forming their own company, they became what was called a charter company, in which the charter given to the king to this group, to this company, provided the basis of the government. And it was essentially a written constitution outlining the powers of the colonial governments as well as the right of the colonists. Now, usually these charters had to remain in England because the existence of the charter was what guaranteed control over the colony. So as long as they had it in their possession, they had that guarantee of ownership over their land. So one of the things that they did is they actually stole the charter. They took the charter with them. They weren't supposed to, but they did. And this is a way of just trying to weaken royal control by maintaining direct control over that document. Now, once in the Americas, one thing that they did is they quickly sought about to create this new society based on purified society. So, first off, the church, Congregational Church, it was given a large degree of influence. Now, it's important to note, though, that the Puritan Church, the Congregational Church, was not given control. One thing about the Puritans and the Separatists is that they had experienced what happens when a king is controlling a church. He can basically force everybody to operate his way. So one thing that Puritan societies, even Pilgrim societies, did is they separated secular government from religious government. So a minister could have a large degree of influence over the political leaders, but he himself could not necessarily serve as a political leader. There had to be that divide between offices. But it was a community that depended on participation and membership in the church and following the congregation's lifestyle. Now, people did dissent from the dissenters, so there were some people that disagreed with the Puritans and the Pilgrims. So individuals like Roger Williams, who disagreed over, the role of Native Americans, and Hutchinson over control of the church by male leaders as well as interpretations of Scripture. And so one thing that you could find yourself falling subject to in terms of of punishment was expulsion from the community. And so Rhode Island, many of the people like Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson that were cast out from Massachusetts actually founded Rhode Island. And occasionally what you would see are armies from Massachusetts going into Rhode Island to break up some of these colonial settlements because they had dared to, say, erect a maypole in the middle of the community and used it for celebrations. Now, another thing that dissenters could find themselves being punished with is a charge of witchcraft. So the same processes of witchcraft and witch hunting that were in play in Europe also appeared in the colonies. And so what we got with the Salem witchcraft trials was, a lot of these internal disputes occurring between colonists, spilling out really and beginning with a group of young ladies, but then later continuing on as community grievances played off of each other to the degree of accusing your rival of witchcraft. It grew because torture could be used to compel a confession that could be anything just so long as the pain ended. So again, it's important for us to recognize that it was not a free democratic society in New England. It was one that had controls by the church, although the church itself did not run society. It had that great influence over it. And then in the South, it wasn't a free and democratic society. It was a society in which you aspired to be a plantation owners because that meant wealth. And plantation owners, if they weren't descended from the aristocracy, they mimicked their ways. And so control was always, one's freedom was determined by how much control you exerted over others. So if you were a wealthy plantation owner, you were at the top of the food chain. You controlled your household. You controlled anybody who worked for you, as well as the slaves that you owned. Now then you have the middle colony. So if the other two colonial regions have those very distinct but homogeneous cultures, the middle colony has a distinct but heterogeneous culture. What makes it unique is that it laid in between the two, and it had all sorts of combinations. So if you look at New York, for example, started off as a Dutch colony. New Netherlands, with its principal city or colony of New Amsterdam, which was later conquered during one of the colonial wars and converted into an English colony that still maintained a Dutch culture. You had Maryland. This was a colony that was established by George Calvert, the first Lord Baltimore. It was one of two major proprietary colonies, in which a proprietary colony meant that the family, whoever owned the colony, determined government, determined how land was doled out, etc. It was his own little fiefdom. And initially, Maryland was intended to be a haven for English Catholics, and while a large bit of it was settled by Catholics, the Catholics in Maryland never numbered more than 50%. Instead, you ended up having a number of Anglicans and Congregationalists and Quakers and all sorts of other religious groupings, Presbyterians coming in and settling. Pennsylvania is the other major proprietary colony, and it was established by William Penn because they were Quakers. So if anybody was usually hounded among the dissenting groups, it was the Quakers, arguably as much, if not more, than the Catholics. Quakers believed in an inner light, God's inner goodness, beauty, his inner light shining through all people. And they didn't necessarily have ministers in the traditional sense. Instead, in their meeting houses, people would sit quietly, and anybody that felt that inner light moving, that urge, could get up and testify on what was on their heart, on their mind, what they had learned. Quakers were pacifists. They did not believe in fighting. They did not believe in wars of defense. They did not believe in paying taxes if they knew that those taxes were going to go to militaries, to belligerent purposes. And then on top of that, they didn't want to swear oaths. It was against their religion to swear. So one thing that the United States, when it came to Quakers, had to address was, all right, if a Quaker is testifying before a court, how do you quote unquote swear them in, because they can't stand up there and say, I swear to tell the truth. Definitely can't put their hand on the Bible and do that also. But the Quakers were known as very industrious individuals. They Their communities produced some of the biggest names in businesses, and they were also very well known for being reliable and trustworthy in contracts. So they had a very, 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 very good reputation in the business world in colonial America. Oh, now colonial society, in terms of their economy, it revolved around mercantilism. Mercantilism was the leading economic theory of the time, in which each country sought to amass bullion, in other words, precious metals, gold, silver. And the way that you did this was by establishing a favorable balance of trade. And you established that by limiting your imports and maximizing exports, especially establishing colonies and controlling colonial trade. So, what European countries that were involved in American colonialism did is they usually passed laws that said, okay, you have to ship all raw materials, all goods back to Spain or France or England or the Netherlands before it can be sold elsewhere, and you had to purchase stuff from the home country. So, in the case of Great Britain, what they did is they passed a series of acts: the Navigation Act of 1651, later 1660, and then the Staple Act of 1663. And what this did is it strictly regulated who you could trade with. So, does this mean that there was absolutely no trade between the English and the French colonies? No. A common trade was for certain agricultural goods that French sugar plantations needed to be sold in between the colonies. Uh, but it was a greatly hated one, because that's all you could do was trade those items. So, for example, you were allowed to make hats in, say, Pennsylvania, but you were not necessarily allowed to make a hat and then sell it to Rhode Island. For that, you had to actually, if you were in Rhode Island, you had to buy that hat from England. Likewise, if you wanted sugar from a French colony, you couldn't just import it while you were down there selling your agricultural wares. That sugar actually had to go to England before it could go to the colonies. And in order to go between England and the colonies, it had to be shipped on a French ship, on an English ship, manned by a certain percentage of English sailors. So you get crazy. So, nonetheless, a large industry of smuggling quickly developed in the colonies. After all, if you're going to be down there selling your agricultural wares, your corn or whatever, to a French sugar plantation, why not sneak some rum on board and turn a healthy profit? In fact, some of the leading colonists during the Revolutionary War era were either indirectly tied to the smuggling or outright tied to smuggling. So if you look at the signature of John Hancock, from which we get that saying, put your John Hancock on it. John Hancock, one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. What is he known for? Smuggling. That's how his family got wealthy. Now, the English colonies of all colonies were among the most successful. One thing that was astounding in there is how quickly their population just naturally increased. It doubled at really an exceptional rate. In fact, even Benjamin Franklin remarked on how quickly it populated. And one of the reasons why is, unlike the French, there were no restrictions necessarily on who could immigrate there. The English weren't trying to keep all the Catholics and the Quakers in England. They were happy to see them go somewhere else, and as a result, anybody could move there and establish a new life. indentured servitude could help with that. So population quickly grew. The economies of these colonies quickly grew. And at the same time, they were deeply connected with what was happening in Europe. So George Washington, for example, uh, in addition to being a famous Revolutionary War general and first president of the United States, was also an impeccable interior designer. We have records of his letters to and from his favorite tailors and from stores that he frequented, or well, we didn't frequent them. He ordered from them in Great Britain. And I mean, this guy knew the fashions in Great Britain. I mean, he could tell the tailor down to a stitch how he wanted that jacket to look, what kind of material. In fact, we have jackets in which he's basically ripping his tailor, saying, "Look, dude, last time you sent me a jacket, it was basically made out of a horse blanket. You know, last year's design, last year's material. This year, I want this year's design, this year's material. You know, the fashion of the fashion. So I want the good stuff." So they were deeply connected, you know, not only with the commercial economy, but also with the intellectual movement known as the Enlightenment, which we'll address in greater detail during the Revolutionary War lectures. So the leading thoughts and scientific experiments of the day. Uh, but they were uniquely growing truly colonial. It was a truly colonial society. You know, the colonists may have claimed themselves to be British, but something new was developing culturally. Uh, and one thing about the colonial culture is it did maintain its connections, you know, to the religious developments in England. So the colonies were ground zero of a major religious movement that did happen on both sides of the Atlantic, but it was exceptionally fierce here in the Americas, and that was known as the Great Awakening, in which church attendance greatly grew. This new form of very charismatic preaching came through the colonies in the form of George Whitefield. And just to show you how connected all this was, George Whitefield, he was a European or an English minister, and he had the best publicist in the British colonies, a guy who was a deist, borderline atheist, but happened to have a printing press and knew how to use it because of his wit and his eloquence. And this guy's name was Ben Franklin. So whenever George Whitefield came to town, it was actually George Whitefield Ben Franklin that got the audience primed for George Whitefield through his pamphlets and through his basically his PR campaign, his pre-Whitefield PR campaign. Even though these two had vastly different views on religion. In fact, George Washington once remarked that he went to one of his clients' sermons, and he said that George Whitefield was just so darn good, he almost thought for a minute about putting a coin in the collection plate. So again, it was a world that was growing unique. It was a society that was growing in shape, but it was still connected to events in Europe. Now, if anything could show the connections to Europe, it was the imperial conflicts that quickly spilled over into North America. So what one should notice quickly on this screen is that most of these wars have two names, and that's because there's a name in Europe, and then there's the name in the Americas. So, for example, the War of the League of Augsburg that was fought over, you know, European politics was known as King William's War in the Americas, or in the English colonies. The War of Spanish Succession, which was exactly that, you know, conflict over who was going to succeed to the throne in Spain, was known as Queen Anne's War in the British North America. Then you had the War of Austrian Succession. I'll let you guess what that was over in Europe, which just, you know, I guess they ran out of nicknames, and it's known as the War of Austrian Succession here. Although there was a minor conflict with the Spanish that became known as the War for Jenkins' Ear, because an English sailor or captain got his ear cut off by the Spanish Navy as a punishment for an accusation of smuggling. Anyhow, the key thing here is that what usually happened during these conflicts is that they quickly spilled over in the Americas. You know, the English, they would sit there and try to attack up and take Quebec, and they try to take Montreal. Usually didn't succeed. I'll just spare you the suspense. They did succeed usually, though, in capturing French outposts. So in the course of these three wars, they would eventually gain control over Nova Scotia and Port Royal, some of these key uh, islands guarding the entrance to the St. Lawrence River. Meanwhile, the French, having been much, much better at Native American alliances because they did not try to remove every single Native American within their colonial borders, um, they would usually launch successful attacks against the English frontier and usually repel the English land forces. And inevitably, it would come to a conclusion. If the English colonists got their way, they might actually be able to seize some of this territory from the French. But with the exception of one peace treaty, usually the English king would give this land back, and they wouldn't, demand significant concessions in North America, because there was a prize in England or in Europe that was even greater. So these imperial conflicts are largely one of the reasons for the discontent leading up to the American Revolution. This constant feeling that we're being pulled into this king or that queen's war, and they're not looking out for us. We're being attacked, and we're not being looked out for. We're expected to suffer, but not be defended. So this is going to be a key grievance. Now, the one major conflict that did truly settle things once and for all between the English and the French in North America was the 7 Years' War. This actually started, it was known as the 7 Years' War in England or in Europe, and it was, some argue it was the First World War because it happened there were conflicts on multiple continents, but I would dispute that because you didn't really have it to the sheer extent of World War One. But actually, it didn't start there. It started here at Duquesne. Fort Pitt would be the name the English would give Fort Duquesne after they seized it following this war. From there, the local city that surrounded it would be eventually known as Pittsburgh. That would, go on to give us the Steelers, which unfortunately have been doing a lot better lately than the Dallas Cowboys, my team. At any rate, it started here. Basically, the English lay claim to this whole territory, and the French lay claim to the whole territory. So what the French finally decided to do is say, okay, we're just going to straight up go out there and build a fortress, and that'll be that. We own it because we're there. So they send this young lieutenant colonel by the name of George Washington. He got in over his head during the whole ordeal and almost lost his life during a skirmish with the French and their allies. But this is what really started it. So in the colonies, it starts as early as 1755, 1754. Now, the first major offensive in the colonies really kind of foreshadowed the way that this war was threatening to go. And this was when General Edward Braddock marched out to take Fort Duquesne. And in the course, he was just out-generaled by the Marquis de Montcalm. Braddock himself was killed. George Washington was almost killed during the fighting. And this massive force was quickly repulsed back into English colonial territory. And after that, the English, they're constantly trying to penetrate and to gain access to key French forts and to attack Montreal, but the Marquis de Montcalm, especially using his Native American allies and some of their techniques in the conflicts, just outfought them time after time after time again. So most of the battles were actually French victories. Until finally the two sides met in a major and decisive conflict at Quebec. And what had happened that led up to it is they had a new prime minister in England, William Pitt, Earl of Chatham. And what he decided was that the English were going to use their Prussian allies to fight the war in Europe. So Prussia being a very capable land power, they would fight the land battles, and England would mainly fight on the high seas. And this freed up English forces to redirect troops to the American colonies and to French colonies in other parts of the world. And so once they started getting these elite troops, just sheer numbers started to wear the French down until finally the English fought their way to Quebec, and there on the plains of Abraham, uh, Marquis de Montcalm was killed. And following that, the French were forced to the negotiation table, and there they signed the Treaty of Paris. And what this did is the French surrendered all of their lands in North America and gave it to the British. I mean, to the Spanish. Oh, I'm sorry, gave it to the British. And so Canada suddenly became British. All of that territory, all of this territory back here that the colonists desperately wanted for new lands, that suddenly seemed open to them. So for once, it seemed like things were going the colonists' way. But as we see when we get to the American Revolutionary War, this wasn't the beginning of a new era of peace for the colonists. Instead, this would begin the era that ultimately led to the 13 colonies' decision to break from the crown and the birth of the United States of America.